This video is about the history of Bristol Docks in the Middle Ages by me, Mr. Kennett. Now, Bristol really is a story about a place with two rivers. This is the River Avon. This way, here, it's going out to Avonmouth through the Avon Gorge. And if you continue the flow down, this way, it's going out to Bath. Bristol was originally founded on the Avon, really where the Avon met this little stream here. And this stream here is the River Froome. And this way, it's heading out to where IKEA is in North Bristol now. Now, Bristol, we don't really know exactly when it began, but we think it probably began in the early 11th century. And in the early 11th century, really importantly, this was built. A bridge over the Avon. And that bridge was over the first place that the Avon could easily be crossed at its narrowest point. And that bridge allowed a settlement to be built next to it. And then that settlement, a little village, grows that will eventually turn into the town that we know today. Originally, that settlement was not called Bristol, it was called Brigstow. Brig meaning bridge, and stow meaning place. In other words, the place of the bridge. Now, that's not what we call it Bristol. And Bristol was originally called Brigstow, and over time that just gets changed to Bristol. In the 11th century, that little settlement grows. And, really importantly, that little settlement starts trading, because boats came down the Avon and they stopped in the quays of Bristol and started trading goods. And really importantly, those boats were trading with lots of different places, notably places even as far away as Ireland. And originally, those boats from Ireland were trading lots of different goods, but significantly, slaves. And slaves are an important feature of Bristol's history, one that we are not proud of in any way. Now, in the 11th century, as you all know, the Normans led a conquest of England, and they significantly built castles in important towns. Bristol was no different, where a castle was built here. And building a castle here meant that actually the town was now really well defended geographically. It had a river that ran round it and a castle at one end that blocked off the final entrance. Bristol was developing fast. You will also know that the Normans banned slavery, and so as a result, the trade in slaves ended. But the boats kept on coming in, back and forth down the Avon, bringing goods. This leads us into the 12th century. And in the 12th century, Bristol continues to grow. And it continues to grow because more and more trade is coming into the city. More and more trade from places that were actually quite far away. Those places included still Ireland. They included places that were a little bit more local, like Wales, and there's even reports that actually Bristol was trading with countries as far away as Norway. If you look in medieval chronicles from the time, Bristol is known as one of the most significant, prosperous towns, and it continued to grow. This did create problems for the docks though, because as you will notice, if more and more trade is growing here, these boats have limited places to stop. And really, that leads us quite neatly into the 13th century. Because in the 13th century, with so many boats here and the town continuing to grow and prosper, they needed more space. And this leads to the first development of the docks. And in 1240, the burghers of the town, the leaders of the town, decide to begin a new project. And that new project is going to cost them £5,000, which was a significant amount of money in those days. and they decided that they would get men to dig out this patch of land here. And they dug for 7 years, because what they were intending on doing, and they did, was blocking the Froome here and diverting it here. And this here would allow a really, really wide patch of water here, which gave Bristol even more space for more boats to come in and trade with the city. And more came in. And this little patch of water here we call St. Augustine's Reach. And if you're trying to think about this geographically now, this in modern Bristol is what we call the centre. Here is where the Arnolfini is, here is where the watershed is, and here is where the fountains are. I've just undiverted the Froome again. Now, this trade meant that Bristol could continue growing. And as well as still trading with places like Ireland and Wales, actually Bristol continues to grow and starts trading further away with places like France, and towards the end of the 13th century, even places like Spain. And the significant thing that they are bringing into the city at this time is wine. And a lot of it. In fact, tons and tons and tons of it. This leads us really nicely into the 14th century. And in the 14th century, as you can see, Bristol was still doing very well in terms of its trade. The town was still slowly growing, although it had some hiccups along the way in the 14th century with things like the Black Death leading towards a smaller population. Actually, trade was doing pretty well. And more boats were coming into the city at this time. Bristol continued to heavily trade with places like France, and in particular places like Bordeaux and Spain, and actually now Portugal. So Bristol was truly an international port. In addition to, and it definitely was still wine coming into the city, there was a really new product that was being traded with heavily in the 14th century, and that was cloth. These are supposed to be little items of clothing. Cloth became a really big thing that Bristol was trading with at this time. This leads us neatly now into the 15th century. And in the 15th century, Bristol is continuing to do really well. There is still trade going on. The town is developing in the exact way that you'd expect and is growing over time. And is actually now becoming a really significant port and a really significant place in the history of England. They are still continuing to trade with Spain. They are still continuing to trade with France and with Ireland. And still, cloth is really probably the most significant thing that they are trading with, in addition to there always being wine in the city. And over time, Bristol continues, and it's still trading brilliantly. Interestingly, right at the end of the Middle Ages, we get a new feature though. And in the 1480s and the 1490s, some traders decide that they are going to go further than these three here. And right at the end of the Middle Ages, very significantly, one individual does very well out of this. And this man here is John Cabot. And John Cabot, very significantly in 1497, boarded his ship, the Matthew, and the Matthew left the Avon and headed out into the Atlantic. They were the people who eventually would end up landing in North America, one of the first Europeans, if we ignore the Vikings, one of the first Europeans who probably set foot on American soil. And so that is the history of Bristol in the Middle Ages. It's growing, it's developing, it's trading.